What is apathy? It's lack of meaning, right? It's lack of purpose. It's lack of connection.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Okay, Dave Rabin, great to be with you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So we've got good news and bad news here as it pertains to mental health. My dad and mom always started with the bad news, so I'll follow in their footsteps. So we got an issue here. There's 20 million some odd Americans suffering from depression. I think globally we're talking about 1 billion people with some form of mental disorder. So it's 1 out of every 8 people. And it's not only the people themselves who are suffering from a mental disorder, but it's their families that have to provide the care. So really, when we're talking about mental illness, almost no one is unscathed at this juncture.
True.
So that's a very, very significant social problem, not to mention all of the expense connected with it. So the good news is that this is likely the most exciting time in the history of the treatment of mental illness right now. And you're at the bleeding edge of it, the tip of the spear, if you will. And so I'm really, really excited to be with you here today to unpack some of the new therapies or neurocatalytic processes, as you lay out, for neuroplasticity, such that the brain can change and heal. And we can spend some time specifically focusing on ketamine and ketamine-assisted therapy, since that is very much on the front page of virtually every newspaper and magazine at this juncture. And I know this is an area of extreme and profound focus for you. But let's potentially set the chess pieces here, because this is such a complex and complicated issue. And one of the reasons it is so complex is that there are so many diagnoses. The taxonomy is so jumbled, and so many of these diagnoses are based around clusters of similar symptoms. And so I wonder if you could spend a little bit of time kind of untangling the most prevalent and prominent mental disorders and how they present.
Sure. That's a great place to start. I think one of the biggest and most common challenges with mental illness itself is the diagnosis, because the diagnosis in mental health is not associated, in historically speaking, with a take this antibiotic pill for 7 days and then, get some rest and drink some water and have some chicken soup and you'll feel better and then the infection will be gone and you're off on your way, right? It's very much a take this medicine and go to therapy for the rest of your life once you have a diagnosis. And then this is a big change for people, because it's a huge admission of vulnerability, weakness, or at least our society looks at it as weakness. It's really just vulnerability, right? It's that I'm having a hard time right now with XYZ, and that feels like depression, or it feels like sadness, or it feels like I'm not sleeping enough, and so I'm not functioning where I want to be. But that doesn't have to be a terminal diagnosis. And so the problem is that, if you really want to get down to it, which I think is, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, is that it's our misuse of the words that causes a lot of illness for people. I see a lot of patients, and I can tell you that most of my patients, you could call what they have PTSD if you really tried hard to fit it into a box, because we all have trauma. And so I think PTSD, as we'll talk about, is really, and trauma itself is the root of almost all mental illness. But when I am actually treating people, I treat people who have what we call treatment-resistant mental illness. So they've tried at least 2 or more gold standard treatments and not achieved sustained remission. So now they've at least tried 2. And so they can come to me and they're like, well, these aren't working. What do you got for me? And the first thing we treat is illness anxiety disorder, which is the association that we've learned to build between our identity and our sense of self and the being told that we have a diagnosis of a mental illness.
Yes. So there's a tremendous amount of anxiety about the anxiety, and then we become anxious about the anxiety about the anxiousness, and like this is not a very profitable course.
When it creates this negative association in terms of the way that we look at ourselves, right? So if somebody tells you, like you go to a doctor, you actually finally, you're feeling not so good for a while. You put yourself in the position of somebody who might be struggling with waking up and feeling sad every day for a period of months. And finally, you get up the energy to actually go to the doctor and to actually tell that doctor what you're struggling with. And you probably feel a little bit bad about it because you feel that you're alone in this and that other people aren't experiencing what you're experiencing, even though they probably are. And then the doctor says, well, you have a diagnosis of depression. And then all of a sudden it's like a moral injury, right? You're being told there's something wrong with me, especially based on the previous understanding of mental illness, which is now changing thanks to a lot of great research but the previous understanding was there's an imbalance that you're born with, chemical imbalance in your brain, and you need medicine to fix that because you are imperfect the way you are, right? There's something wrong with you the way you are, that you need this medicine to get better. It doesn't mean the medicine can't help, but it means that we're telling people they need it. That they don't need it, right? What they need is they need support and they need love and they need care. And that could involve medicine, or it could involve just a lot of really good psychotherapy and human connection, but it doesn't require the medicine. And if we tell somebody that they have a diagnosis that requires medicine to get better, because that's what some of the other studies show, then we're actually telling people that they are disempowered to their own healing experience. Right? We're saying that you no longer can rely on yourself and trusting yourself to get through this challenge. You have to take this stuff from the outside and add it to what's coming on from inside, because what's inside is not good enough to get through this. Like, what kind of message is that? You know?
Yeah. So that ties very much into what has been our typical understanding of the origin of mental illness. So maybe let's check a few boxes there. So a lot of people would claim like, well, depression just runs in my family. It's genetic. Okay. Yeah, there's like ApoE4 alleles that potentially point to a greater proclivity or risk factor for Alzheimer's or something like that. But by and large, can we blame genetics for the epidemic of mental illness?
Short answer is no, because and every study to date, even the studies looking at things, very severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression, anxiety, and others have not seen any consistent, statistically significant correlation between genetics, the 4-letter DNA code, the A's, C's, T's, and G's. It's the same in every cell in our bodies. We have not seen correlations between that and mental illness that are significant. But what we do see is there's a relationship that's statistically significant between past trauma and these symptoms.
Okay.
And epigenetic code. So what's on the DNA that tells certain parts of the DNA, like cortisol receptors, to go turn up or turn down in somebody who has had trauma that was significant enough, then that is actually changing the way the DNA is expressed. And so there is a genetic, or there is a layer of the illness that is related to the DNA that gets passed on over time. But the difference between it saying it's genetic versus epigenetic is genetic means we can't change it.
Right.
And epigenetic means we have every ability to change it.
Yeah.
So it's just about figuring out how, not if.
I think these, honestly, neuroplasticity and epigenetics, and to some degree the microbiome, has informed this new era of agency, sort of the end of genetic determinism. It's more or less like what Einstein and Bohr and Planck did to Newtonian physics at the beginning of the 20th century. These studies, which you're, at the center point of, are pointing to a similar phenomena, which is that, there is the world, the underlying reality is not fixed, that we have a tremendous amount of agency to change things, that there is no foundational building block of depression.
Right.
So And so when you talk about epigenetics, for example, so the turning on and off of genes and how they express and how they code for certain proteins, for example. So there could be like BDNF, which is kind of gets floating around quite a bit on the internet now, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So that is your genetics, your underlying nucleotide sequences could code for that, the creation of that particular protein. But whether or not that gene expression is turned on or off might be influenced by external or environmental factors like trauma. Is that a fair understanding? Yeah.
Because trauma encodes for a threat response or a survival response in our bodies that is diverting resources to systems that are required to fight, flight, or freeze to get out of survival threat and into safety. So, for example, BDNF is a learning neurochemical that's very important for learning new things, strengthening learning of old things. It's very, very much secreted actively in our amygdala, the fear center of our brains, when we're learning to associate fear or safety with different experiences. So if you can imagine, and again, this is just more of a hypothetical, but just to help people understand what the role of epigenetics is, that, and Rachel Yehuda discovered this with respect to the cortisol receptor from her work at Yale and Sinai, studying Holocaust survivors and really understanding that people something we've observed for probably over 100 years now, which is the idea that people who have had PTSD or severe trauma in their lives will pass on an increased predisposition to PTSD and other mental health disorders to their offspring and their offspring's offspring, and even their offspring's offspring's offspring for potentially many generations. So Rachel found this epigenetic linkage by studying the cortisol receptor and cortisol system in Holocaust survivors and showing that there was indeed changes in epigenetic markings on the DNA for these cortisol systems that were passing down across time. And then now this has been replicated in mice and rodents that shows without a doubt, if you traumatize a rodent, that for at least 4 generations, we pass down changes to things like cortisol receptors, BDNF potentially, and where these molecules are expressed and how much. And so learning itself, as one example, learning is really important to human survival, but it's not that important to learn new things when you're running from a lion, or if your body perceives that we're running from danger. Learning is more about, let's get out of danger and let's learn what we can do better to avoid danger when we're out of danger, right? And so we might be diverting and having learned over potentially hundreds or thousands of years, depending on our genetic or our DNA line and our ancestry, and how much trauma they faced, we may actually have learned to decrease the secretion or the effectiveness of something like a learning molecule like BDNF because we spent so much time worried and running from threat, right? So I don't think that I haven't seen a linkage to BDNF in this way, but the point is that everything we experience is changing our epigenetic code in some ways. It's just about right now, how much of it can we actually measure?
Yeah, maybe you can help me understand the mechanism by which or how which acquired traits are heritable transgenerationally. So, I understand that genes can be methylated, for example. So there's like a little kind of hydrogen/carbon lollipop that can attach itself to a gene and influence the gene expression, for example. And then there's also histones and the way that they interact with proteins and whatnot, or genes that can impact how they're coding for certain proteins.
Yeah.
So I can understand how that happens, but then how is that actually passed down? Like I've read some things about like that there's like actual micro mRNA in sperm that could actually sit kind of next to the genetic code, which is pretty wild. But what is your understanding of the mechanism by which epigenetics functions transgenerationally?
I think we don't understand all of it, by the way. Yeah. So it's not, and it's an extraordinarily complicated process, fantastically complex. It's really incredible. Yeah. But what I can tell you is that it seems like if you think about epigenetic regulation, so the layer on top of the DNA that tells the same DNA that's in every cell that when it's skin, it's supposed to be skin and make skin proteins and not stomach proteins. And when it's in the stomach, it's supposed to be stomach and not skin.
Differentiation.
Right.
Yeah.
And that differentiation could be because we have the same map of our entire cells in every cell except sperm and egg that we would have on each of those cells, the code on top of the code that tells that cell to be one cell or another, to function this way or that way, right? So if you think about methylation being what tells skin to turn up or down, that you add a methyl group to a skin protein in the stomach, which tells it to turn down, you take that away in the skin so that skin turns up in the skin,
right?
Then that same thing happens with stress. So if you have an intense stress, then you'd have a burst in cortisol. Then you have another intent that's supposed to happen one time. Then cortisol goes back to normal. Everything goes back to normal and everybody's good. And then we're in safety again. Now you apply that chronically. So every day there's a huge cortisol burst. Sometimes that might last for many, many, many hours. And then what happens to the receptor? Decides to pull in, right? Because it's overstimulated. Right. And pretty much all of our receptors in the body, when they're overstimulated, they just withdraw or they desensitize themselves because they're having too much stimulation, too much cortisol around. And so then that's going to send a signal into the cell that says, hey, we don't need as much cortisol receptor because we keep getting overstimulated. So make less, right? So then that's sending a signal that says, put more methyl groups on the cortisol receptor gene at these spots. So then those methyl groups get literally added to those carbon hydrogen lollipops you so aptly described. They get added to these parts of the code for that cortisol receptor gene that says, make less of this. And if you make less of this, then you'll get less cortisol receptor. And then that cell's become, when that cell's being made into a sperm and egg, let's go with sperm, for instance, the cortisol receptor gene that has the methyl groups on it from this chronic stress exposure divides, and then half of in meiosis, half of the DNA goes into one sperm versus another, and then there's a 50-50 chance that we're going to pass that on to our offspring, right? Because each cell has a 50-50 split of our DNA, each sperm. So that sperm also still has the methyl groups on it. The methyl groups don't leave, from what we can tell. And there's other stuff that's happening other than just methyl groups, but just as one example of a marker, an epigenetic marker, those stay on the DNA and then they get also passed on to the offspring.
Yeah. So let's ground this in something real life, for example. So let's just say that there is a trauma-inducing event in someone's life. So that might be a horrible act of abuse or neglect, capital T kind of trauma. That then gets interpreted by the body in a particular way, stimulates the overproduction of cortisol, for example, every time that memory is resurfaced and even remotely labile.
Can I add something to that? And every time they had that experience as a child, it was always around the smell of buttered popcorn. So now there's an association between the smell of buttered popcorn and being abused and being worthless and not worthy of love, right? So now you take that into the future, and every single time that person smells buttered popcorn, it reminds them that they are of their trauma, which they can then flash back to, and it reminds them of the sentiment around the trauma, which is you're not worthy of love, right? Because you deserve to be abused to get value, to be valued, right? And then it creates this loop. So what that is causing the change to the cortisol receptor. So then what's really amazing about what we now know, which is where the safety tools come in, is now that you've had a fear response, abuse, feelings of worthlessness, disconnection, right? Lack of love and affection associated with the smell of buttered popcorn and childhood and everything else that was that age that you were at, and maybe parenting and anything else that was happening at that time. And now we can go in and say, okay, well, let's expose you to the smell of buttered popcorn in safe environments. Right. So let's put you around lots of people who love you, who care about you, who you have absolutely no doubt about the fact that you can trust them. Maybe it's your therapist, maybe it's family, friends, what have you. And let's put you in that environment where you don't question your safety at all, and let's expose you to the smell of buttered popcorn. And then let's expose you to the pictures of you as a child during that age. Let's talk about what was happening in your life during that time as a child. And then if you even, and you can do that without any drugs,
Right.
to get somebody to start to recondition their fear response, which then we've shown in mice is actually extinguishing it. So future offsprings of mice, if you don't do anything to them to extinguish the fear response, the offspring still fear the smell of buttered popcorn.
Mm-hmm. And so in that process of exposure therapy in combination with talk therapy or psychotherapy, in some ways you are remarking the neural connection around that particular trauma, or changing the nature of that connection, where it might have been at one point kind of marked with a spike of epinephrine and kind of solidified into this deep pathway. You are essentially rechanging you're changing one's perspective or perception of that particular trauma or memory or association, I suppose. Yeah.
Which, as above, so below, as you change your perception and your connection to it and your feelings of safety versus fear around that experience and the surrounding experiences, you also change your neural networks that are connected around those experiences.
Right.
So the part of your brain that was talking about buttered popcorn now might actually talk about affection and feeling good rather than feeling threatened, because you've changed the association. Right. And then that goes all the way back down to the epigenetics of the way the neurons are making proteins that talk to each other, how the proteins are made that tell the neurons to grow towards a sense of positivity and joy and connection rather than disconnection and abuse and fear and shame. Right. And so it can actually shift the neural networks and how they're formed, and then all the way down to the epigenetic level to cortisol and all these other things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time. Like, we can't just expect that you're going to have one positive, meaningful, positive experience, and then it's going to awaken you to this idea that you can do this. And all of a sudden, you just change it in one day. We took years, sometimes decades to get to where we are right now in this moment. So it just takes, once you recognize it, you can do the work very quickly, but it does take time and patience with the process to retrain ourselves the way we want to.
Yeah. And I think we might have talked about this in our prior conversation, but I know that there's been some clinical research around exposure therapy in combination with like beta blockers, for example. So, you can introduce like a spider with someone with massive arachnophobia.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can expose them to that fear while they're on a beta blocker, you can actually reshape the neural connection around that particular phobia to have some fairly positive, long-lasting results. So
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. So, okay. So,
and the same with psychedelic molecules in a slightly different way, and the same with things like Apollo.
Totally.
Right? Because it's all about how do you make the body feel safe or remind the person. It's a reminder.
Yeah.
How do you remind yourself that you're safe? Because your heart's not going through the roof and your blood pressure is not going through the roof and you're not sweating out your palms, right? There's so many different ways to do it around the thing that you used to think was threatening.
Right. Well, it's sort of like knowing that snake that's coming, that's, serpentining his way across the floor here is actually not poisonous.
Right.
Versus a rattlesnake or something like that.
Right.
And
it might actually even be a speaker wire.
Yeah, it might. In fact, it is. Sorry. So we've addressed the genetic component of it, so that there's much more prevalence towards mental disorders around epigenetics and epigenetic inheritance of methylated genes per se, versus genetic. So, and then we at the same time talked about some of the sort of the biopsychosocial inputs that can shape the epigenetic on and off switch, if you will. Let's talk about sort of the biochemical theory of the origin of mental illness. And this is a very hot topic right now because it speaks specifically to our obsession with serotonin. And so can you unpack a little bit of our history around linking mental disorders with biochemical imbalance?
Sure. I think there's a lot we could talk about here.
Yeah.
I think maybe I can. For the longest time, we didn't know anything about the biochemical connections to mental illness, and until the discovery of LSD and a number of other interesting neuroactive molecules that targeted the serotonin receptor system. LSD was discovered, I think, in the late 30s, early 40s, and then by Albert Hofmann, and then distributed around the world, not knowing what it did. And ultimately, that between the study of that and the gut-brain axis and starting to understand what was going on in the gut, we then were able to realize there's a whole lot of serotonin receptors down here, and there's a whole lot of serotonin. Let's see what that does. And then we realized that it was an important emotional molecule. And then eventually that led to the development of things like monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which are the very first real antidepressants, and then tricyclic antidepressants, and then SSRIs, which came around later, like Zoloft and Prozac.
Right. And so we sort of backed our way in to this notion that lower concentrations of serotonin are associated with depression and bipolar disorder, mental disorders.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think it's a combination of things because in animal models, it was pretty apparent in a lot of situations, not all, but that animals that had serotonin deficiency appeared depressed, right? They appeared like there was some kind of depressed, what we call like a phenotype, which is an expression of what's going on underneath. And again, these are animal models, so they're not perfect, but by any means, but they were, a hint in that direction. And then there was this drive that actually happened where I was trained, that was a coordinated effort between Tom Detry from Yale, who's a very famous psychiatrist, and David Kupfer and a number of other people who ran psychiatry at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic in Pittsburgh. And these two were, and a number of the other psychiatrists and neuroscience folks at that time were trying to figure out, how do we make psychiatry more of a medical specialty rather than this kind of, something that's like drenched in theory, right? Where everything's like psychoanalysis and coming in 3 to 5 days a week and sitting on a couch, talk to somebody, and there's not even a mention of a molecule, and there's no predictive element of understanding how and when somebody's going to get better or worse.
And symptoms are all self-reported, and there's very little scan technology in the early days, right? So you couldn't really look at fMRI images or SPECT or anything like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And everything, so all the diagnosis, everything was made through conversation.
Yeah.
And it was extremely subjective. But the subjective abilities of therapists and psychiatrists was excellent, right? We were highly trained folk who were really, really good at being able to deliver psychotherapeutic interventions.
Yeah.
And we also all had to go through our own psychotherapy during training. So many people were either doing individual one-on-one regular psychodynamic Freudian or actually psychoanalytic 3 to 5 days a week while in training. Back then it was required. And then Thomas Detry came around, and of course the results of that were fine, but they were missing a large segment of the population, obviously, because anybody who's ever worked with anybody who's mentally ill knows that therapy alone is really hard when somebody's very sick and can't really engage. And so medicine, there is a place for medicine. And so, Tom Detry came around during this time around the medicalization of psychiatry in the 80s, 90s in particular, and came to Western Psych from Yale and basically said, we're going to turn the psychoanalytic institution into a Western, what we consider to be an objective Western medical practice.
Right.
And then the DSM the Diagnostics Manual of Mental Illness came out of that from Western Psych.
Right.
The very first one. It was in like the late 70s or something like that. And that changed everything. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, the release of that document that said, a huge book, right? This is, if you check off these boxes for depression, you should be prescribed an SSRI. You should be prescribed a tricyclic or MAOI inhibitor. Right. And it tried to formularize it all to a bunch of check boxes, checking off diagnostics, and then giving a diagnosis that then you were billing for, and then prescribing a specific medical routine.
Right.
And that created a lot of problems because it not only created this idea around the diagnosis that, especially that, has happened now, which is I have to give a diagnosis to you to get paid by insurance for giving you care, even if you're healthy.
Right.
I still have to give you something, which is not really the point, right? Then it changes the relationship, because the diagnosis is for me to communicate to my other doctor colleagues about the patterns going on in you. It's not really for you as the patient.
Right.
It's for you. It's for the billing.
Yeah.
Right. It's for billing, and it's for communicating patterns of illness. If I give that to you and you misunderstand the use of that word, depression or major depression, then you might think I am sick forever. And that's exactly what we don't want you to think. But that's what ultimately has happened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the intention could have been noble to
Right.
medicalize this field and to better understand the biochemistry behind this phenomenon and how to address it through pharmacology. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, not at all.
But
It's just,
unfortunately, just the way that we mechanize things in the West in particular, that it has had consequences that aren't necessarily ideal. Like the treatments don't always work, and there's really no bioindividuality approach to the treatment, or the prescription. So,
well, it was radically reductionist, right? It
Yeah.
was to the point of saying, well, it's all about serotonin, and it's all about the imbalance of this molecule, and it's all about these receptors not functioning well, and so let's just focus on that.
Right.
That, of course, is not the full story, because the brain is so vastly complex.
Yeah. So let's break that down. And for people that haven't been immersed in serotonin or kind of neurotransmitters. So serotonin is known as a neurotransmitter, as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So essentially something that will inhibit activity between neurons, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, it depends on the receptors being used, but yeah.
And it's synthesized from an essential amino acid known as tryptophan. So some people supplement with 5-HTP if they're not getting enough tryptophan, and in combination with B6, your body is synthesizing serotonin, this chemical messenger internally, often in the gut. 90% of it, as you say, can be found in the gut. It can actually be a postbiotic or a metabolite of particular bacteria, Streptococcus and Enterococcus in your gut. So anyways, it's a fascinating and very important neurotransmitter, but we've potentially coronated it inappropriately. So there was obviously, or for those of us who've been following this, there was a big paper that came out in the New York Times in July, basically more or less debunking the theory of serotonin. And a lot of people in the neuroscience community sort of already knew this to some degree.
We suspected.
Yeah, there was some clinical trials, I think, at some point where they basically removed tryptophan from people's diets. And so basically these people could have no serotonin produced endogenously, and they didn't show any greater prevalence for being depressed. So anyways, but I think what this showed is that it's not about serotonin on the synapse necessarily, but there might be some other mechanism by which serotonin is effective. Because, and let me ask you this question because I'm not sure if it's true, but from what I understand, there is a greater rate of self-reported well-being or happiness associated with higher concentrations of serum serotonin. So there is,
and all monoamines, like
Yes.
dopamine and
Right.
and the whole shebang, right?
So do you have any spidey sense there in terms of what's the other mechanism by which serotonin might be playing a role here?
So I think that I love this conversation and where this is going. So I think that serotonin is so interesting because it's really just vastly misunderstood. It's not that it doesn't have an important role. I think, as we'll get to, I think the role of serotonin in mental health and consciousness is absolutely essential, especially at one receptor site that we'll talk about, because serotonin has maybe dozens of receptors, different kinds of receptors, but there's one in particular called 5-HT2A that has also been implicated as one of the primary serotonin receptor sites that psychedelic medicines like MDMA, DMT, LSD, psilocybin all bind to mescaline.
Right.
So that it's been found to be critical, that receptor activation, for all of these psychedelics to work, particularly LSD and psilocybin, which is really interesting. So I think the issue with serotonin is that what we're seeing from this huge study that came out in July, which I think was a University College of London study that's called an umbrella study. So it's like a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, which is the biggest kind of study you can do. So it was in over 100,000 people worldwide, I think.
Wow.
And it showed, effectively, just looking across all the results of all the work on serotonin, SSRIs, and depression that have been done, what if the questions predominantly were like, what is having the biggest impact on depression, or what features or attributes of an individual would make them most likely to suffer from depression? And it doesn't seem to be genetic from prior studies, and it doesn't seem to be a serotonin imbalance, because that was never actually proven in large scale.
Right.
Because if you're sad for a long enough time, you will induce a serotonin imbalance. So is it the imbalance that comes first? Which is the question we always ask, right? It's chicken or egg. Is it the imbalance that comes first? Or is it you had a really, really, big set of really hard times, and now you have lower serotonin in your body because you've been feeling down for a while, legitimately? Like, why invalidate that negative experience? So what this paper showed ultimately was that there is no known statistically significant correlation between having low serotonin levels for any reason and depression. What we do see, however, is that there is a very statistically significant correlation between trauma and depression.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very statistically significant correlation between doing exercise and feeling better from depression, which is a naturally serotonergic activity, and a dopamine releasing activity, and an endorphin releasing activity, right? So that is encouraging to the monoamine model that says if you increase the amount of naturally increase the amount of molecules in the serotonin, dopamine, et cetera group, using things like movement, which gets anxiety out of the body and then also naturally rewards the body, that people will feel better. And that trauma is likely to be at the source of all of what makes people end up either receiving a downstream diagnosis of depression or PTSD or ADHD. The symptoms are not the illness. The symptoms are the pattern of how the actual illness, which is the unresolved trauma, is manifesting in the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I interviewed an interesting doctor, a guy named Chris Palmer. I was mentioning him to you before we started recording. And he has a very interesting theory about the nature of mental illness. And his goal was really to create a unified theory kind of upstream from all of the different diagnoses. And where he landed was that essentially mental disorders are metabolic disorders of the brain. And, it's very thought-provoking, but, he has a number of different hypotheses around serotonin itself. Is that serotonin also seems to be involved with the mitochondria in terms of the upregulating of the production of ATP, so of energy. So there may be some sort of correlation there, because generally, when you're low energy, that is often a trait or symptom of many of these diseases that have been given these various classifications or whatever. And then there also does seem to be a relationship between serotonin and mitochondrial biogenesis. So the creation of new mitochondria, especially in neurons that are highly require a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of energy production. Anyways, it's an interesting hypothesis. But I think the moral of this story is that, we don't necessarily know the answer, that it is, the brain is the most complex organ in the world, in the universe that we know of at this, anyways. And it's multilinear in terms of all the mechanisms that are happening at any one time. So how effective then have Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac, SSRIs been in treatment?
I mean, it depends on the disorder. If we're talking about depression, it's probably about 50% of people get
some temporary relief.
Some
basically.
relief. Yeah. And how long that lasts varies quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
In PTSD, it's something like only 30% that actually respond to the medicines. So there's over 70% of people that don't. And then in anxiety disorders like OCD and other things, there's usually a slightly higher response rate.
Okay. So anxiety disorders, are they mostly given benzodiazepines or is it,
no, mostly SSRIs.
Mostly
now.
SSRIs.
Yeah. But I think, again, if we think about what an SSRI is doing, it is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
Right.
So it's, if you imagine the synapse of your brain that is communicating one message to another neuron and sending the message across, that your one cell is releasing a burst of serotonin, and then the serotonin fills the synapse, just like we were talking about cortisol earlier, right?
Right.
And then the receptors get overstimulated.
Yeah.
On a chronic long-term basis, we see that the receptors start to pull back, right? People start to experience side effects that are related to desensitization, numbing, decreased ability of sexual arousal, orgasm, right?
Lack of passion about hobbies or
apathy,
pleasure, or
right?
anything, yeah.
And the reason for that, this is why this is so interesting to me, is because there's so much we can learn from the use of these medicines in the real world in patients.
Mm-hmm.
So when you administer based on the side effect profile and the positive effects, we know that SSRIs like Paxil and Zoloft work for the people they work for because they induce a sort of emotional numbing by narrowing the emotional window. So it's not to say you can't experience sad feelings, but your window of how sad you're gonna get is blunted, and your window also of how positive and happy things are going to get is also blunted, because serotonin is not a positive or a negative only emotional regulator. It regulates emotion in general, right? It helps support the whole range of emotion. The range of emotion is very much related to how meaningful things are to us, right? The more meaningful something is, the more we can relate to it, the better it makes us feel, then maybe there's more going on there, right? But maybe that is not about, to offer a complementary theory, maybe it's not about flooding the receptor, because flooding the receptor creates numbing and apathy and decreased pleasure and sadness. So what if it's really about burst activation, right? Yeah. Because what people are reporting from taking SSRIs as a common side effect for extended period of time is feeling apathy. What is apathy? It's lack of meaning, right? It's lack of purpose. It's lack of connection and emotional blunting. What do psychedelics do? The opposite.
Yeah.
Right? So you administer LSD or psilocybin, and you're getting activation at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, the same one we're talking about, that are flooded by SSRIs. And then you get an activation at that receptor that's a huge burst, which is caused by a giant release of serotonin for a very short window of time, like 4 to 8 hours. And the receptor is activated additionally by some of the psychedelic molecules to increase its ability to clamp onto serotonin, which is called an allosteric binding pathway. It's like psilocybin and LSD can bind the receptor main part sometimes, but they can also bind the side, and then it increases the tightness of binding of serotonin. So then you get this huge burst activation, which happens only for 4 to 12 hours or something like that. And that creates this radical shift in meaning, where something as mundane as, oh, that song that I never used to like, now I have complete new respect for it. I never realized how much I liked this song, right? All of a sudden that song means something to me because I've shifted my perspective. And Franz Vollenweider, one of my favorite psychedelic scientists based in Switzerland, who's doing some of the best research on LSD and psilocybin and the receptor pathway, showed this, in fact, in the last 5 years, that if you administer ketanserin, which is a 5-HT2A serotonin receptor blocker, orally active in humans, you just give them this pill or a sugar pill, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, give people ketanserin to block the 5-HT2A receptor or sugar pill. Nobody knows what they're taking. And then you also give them psilocybin or LSD. Only the people who took the placebo sugar pill actually had a change in meaning from the psychedelic.
Got it.
Only those people had burst activation at the 5-HT2A receptor. So when you think about what we're doing to people with SSRIs and the side effect profile, loss of meaning, and you think about what psychedelics do and how they work, which we also just figured out at this particular receptor site, which is create burst activation, which then creates this ubiquity of meaning almost, right? Then maybe it's the burst of the serotonin that matters. Maybe it's not just having more or less. Do you know what I mean? It's receptor occupation over time.
So
and
interesting.
density of the molecular release that matters.
And so with some forms of psychedelic therapy, are we essentially opening up new areas of the brain to talk with other different and divergent areas of the brain that they wouldn't otherwise be talking to, hence sort of creating, new synapses, but also synaptic density and synaptic efficiency, et cetera. Is that a fair?
Yeah.
Is that a fair?
Yeah,
outline?
I'd say that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the reason why that happens is another thing that's really interesting, but that maybe we'll have time to dive into a little bit. But I think it's really that yes, our brains are intense automation machines. They're the most advanced automation machines that have ever existed. They suck in information, they experience what's associated with that information, thoughts and feelings, and then they loop it positively in a feedback loop to either avoid or attract to a particular situation. And every time we repeat that, those neural networks get stronger automatically.
And is that what the default mode network is, basically? Is the patterns in which we fall into that are the most ingrained and
at rest.
And so they become essentially bottom-up behaviors at that point. They are subconscious behaviors.
Yeah, I don't know if I would refer to this bottom up in this capacity, but they're definitely entrained. They're so highly entrained that we have forgotten that they're even there.
Right.
Like the way we think about ourselves. Or as a physical sensation, it's like the way we don't feel our clothes on our skin because we've worn clothes for so long that now we notice way more when we're naked because we're cold than we do when we wear clothes where we're comfortable.
Right. Or when something doesn't fit quite
exactly.
Right. You've been eating too many croissants in Paris. Too much biographical information there. So let's talk about different kinds of ways that we can disrupt that default mode network, sort of agents of kind of neurocatalytic processes, basically. So maybe describe what a neurocatalytic agent is, and we'll start from there.
So neurocatalytic agent is something that I would describe as something that accelerates neural activity. So not just neural activity as in just one neuron talking to another, but in this case, I guess what I'm referring to is neural activity around learning and neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. So neuroplasticity is really defined as or understood as the term that relates to how the brain learns, which is in three primary ways. It's making new neurons, neurogenesis, repairing old neurons, neuroregeneration, and then the most common way that happens on a basically daily basis for us is synaptogenesis.
Right.
So building new connections between existing neurons, making new wiring between things that are already there.
Right. And neuroplasticity is highly concomitant with learning, but it also seems to be absolutely central around addressing mental illness.
Well, right, because we're talking about unlearning old behaviors that don't serve us and relearning new behaviors that do, including the way we think about ourselves. Right. So if you just, many of us don't even realize that we have a certain behavior pattern we've established that is the way that I describe myself. Mm-hmm. And when somebody would ask you, like, how would you describe yourself? You might say, like, well, I'm a total piece of shit, and how is that possibly going to make you feel good about yourself or confident or whatever, if that's how you actually think about yourself inside versus thinking about yourself as a joyful person seeking more joy in the world.
Right. Well, It's tricky because we are pre-programmed by our senses, the instruments that we have at our disposal, to feel a sense of separateness, because for reasons of, that relate to sort of a biological imperative, we need to perceive threat. So all of our senses are geared towards perception in the external world. So we begin to label everything in kind of the foreground of our visual field. For example, well, there's a camera that feels safe enough, but like there's something that might not feel safe, and there's a plant, and there's Wellington, and like there's a light, and as one develops their visual capabilities early in life, you begin to label every single thing outside of you.
Right.
And as that seems fine and dandy kind of when you're 3 or 4 years old. That's absolutely, that's part of your self-preservation. And but as you become a teenager or an adolescent, you start to label things around you like, well, there's someone that has more money than I do, or there's someone that has greater social status, or is more beautiful given the aesthetic mores of society or whatever. And inherent to that labeling of everything in your external world is a self-labeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that self-labeling is what informs the ego, the symbol that we give ourselves. And then we confuse who we are with the symbol that we give ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm Dave Rabin, neuroscientist, and I'm married, and I've got a snappy blazer on. You become those things, instead of whatever you might want to say, the consciousness upon which all that phenomenon is etched, or we can kind of, get into all of that kind of stuff. But that it's the hyper association with one's ego, with the roles that one plays in society, that feeds this sense of perceived deficiency. Right. And so that we're always seeking out external agents to assuage that feeling of perceived deficiency or our discontents, et cetera. And that can lead to all sorts of, detrimental behaviors, addictions of all sorts, et cetera. So this is kind of what we're sort of up against, mm-hmm. given, our God-given innate sensory instruments and science's genius to enhance them with telescopes and hearing aids and things like that. But still, so in a way, it's almost like we have to transcend part of our senses, and that is hard within the culture, the specific culture that we live in, which constantly tells us that you are an individual, that you are separate from other people, that you're separate from nature, that pits you in competition and in comparison with everything in your external consciousness.
Yeah.
So, that's
the default mode.
And that's the default mode. And this wasn't always true. We often confuse culture and nature. So we say, oh, well, it's human nature to be selfish, or to be self-absorbed, or to want to accumulate goods and stuff and services, what have you. But that is
to own things.
But that is a confusion between culture and nature, because that was not our nature for the overwhelming majority of the history of the human species. We lived in geodomes with 50 other people and raised our children communally, and hunted for food together for the group.
And shared everything.
Yeah. And so when you have pre-programmed senses that are already geared to make you feel separate for a biological imperative, and then you have a culture lopping on a modus operandi geared towards the individual incessantly, nonstop, at every turn, what are you going to end up with? I mean, our friend Gabor Mate uses the Petri dish as a wonderful example. It's like, you try to grow a pluripotent stem cell inside a Petri dish that has ammonia and alcohol in it. It's not going to do well. And you call that biological medium a culture. So what is the biological medium that you and I and my children are growing up in? Well, it's a particular kind of culture. When that culture is toxic and caustic, the only expected result is trauma-inducing events that lead to all these forms of mental disorders. And so it's like, shouldn't be like a huge surprise what's happening. Fortunately, the good news, again, the gospel, is that there are all of these emerging protocols to address some of these core issues. So let's get into some of them, sort of the non-psychedelic ones first, and then potentially crawl our way into some ketamine therapy, and maybe we can talk about some of the other ones. So when you talk about protocols for neurocatalytic agents, what are some of those protocols that we can leverage?
So there are 4 major things that we can do, but they all come, before I even get into that in any depth, it really comes back to one thing, which is safety, right?
Yeah.
So if we think about the body and the way the body was designed, not even in just us humans, but going back to the ancient mammals of 50 million years ago, and even ancient reptiles, were split into 2 fundamental nervous systems. One is the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system, and the other one is the parasympathetic rest and digest, recovery, safety nervous system. The parasympathetic system is responsible for everything we do during recovery: reproduction, immunity, slowing metabolism, making sure that we can sleep and rest and actually recover our energy, and empathy, creativity, everything we do when we are safe. And we can do when we're safe. We're not running from a lion, right? When we're running from a lion, we want all of the resources to go to skeletal muscle, motor cortex, amygdala, motor,
respiratory rate,
heart and lungs,
rate,
right, to get us out of that threatening situation. So all of that is hardwired in us. So it's critical for us to understand what's hardwired, because I don't know if anybody here remembers The Matrix, but one of my favorite lines that Morpheus says to Neo when he first gets him into the Matrix or unplugged or what have you, is there are some rules that can be bent and there are others that can be broken. And when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, those rules do not break. So if you know that what you're walking into with what's hardwired in the body and what the body is trained over millions of years to do in response to different things, all of a sudden it provides a heck of a lot of clarity as to what we can absolutely change, right? And what we can't.
Yeah. No, I mean, you could look at mental illness or chronic disease in general as adaptive mechanisms that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years being hijacked by culture.
Right.
Because, we were meant to store fat. We were meant to release melatonin at a certain hour of the evening to get proper sleep. There was all of these adaptive mechanisms that we developed over millennia. And now, we're in culture gives us endless access to any kind of food in and out of season in the palm of our hand. Let's get it here in 5 minutes. There's no scarcity. There's only growth pathways being stimulated, et cetera.
And anything less than that, you should be worried. Yeah, you should be afraid.
Right. Or exposure to blue light through on-demand entertainment all the time or whatever. There's all of these ways that we've essentially hijacked adaptive mechanisms and turned them into, honestly, maladaptive mechanisms. So, in a way, it's actually, it's a bit of an intellectual exercise, but you can kind of go back and be like, okay, well, what is nature's foundational intelligence telling me, me, the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution? What is that telling me about the adaptive mechanisms in my body?
Right.
And then how do I leverage those for greater flourishing and eudaimonia and et cetera, experience of joy?
It's telling us that we want to feel safe and that we need to feel safe.
Right.
In our own skin. So, and the amygdala is a contrast detection machine. So it's not necessarily detecting fear. We call it the fear center, but it detects fear as newness, fear as unfamiliarity, fear as different than me. And the more stressed we are, the more likely we are to perceive difference as threat.
So can we only really instantiate neuroplasticity in the parasympathetic state? Is it kind of, or do we need to find kind of enough balance between hormones and neurotransmitters that you're alert enough, like you have enough epinephrine or adrenaline, to be able to focus, but then you also have enough, acetylcholine and GABA in terms of being able to actually be calm enough to process thoughts or to consolidate learning or memory. What's going on there between the balance of all these neurochemicals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is neuroplasticity and learning never stop, right? They
Right.
never stop. If you're whether you're sleeping or your brain, if we're asleep, our brain is doing, memory reconsolidation and neuroplasticity through, rearranging of memories and moving memories from short term to long term. When we're awake and we're in a stress state, our bodies are learning around fear. We're learning to associate fear and threat with things that we're experiencing in those moments so that we don't like the buttered popcorn analogy, right? Where we don't actually accidentally think the buttered popcorn smell is safe for us, because if we did, we might put ourselves in danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though that's a false association, we were trained to believe it's true and useful, and therefore we use it and we continue it until it's untrained. Similarly, we experience this with parasympathetic side, right? And I would argue that what the neuroscience is showing is that for us to allocate resources to our optimization of neuroplasticity and learning, we have to optimize functioning of the parasympathetic nervous system, because that's when, even though we can learn when we're under threat and we can learn when we're asleep, when we are actively in an awakeful parasympathetic vagal state, we have most of our resources available to us to be present in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And to take in and to optimize listening, right? What is learning? Learning is listening, and undivided listening is really the goal. Although many of us were never trained to do that properly, being able to tune our brains from doing stuff to just taking in information,
Right,
requires a dominantly parasympathetic, safety-based state of being.
Interesting. So hyperexcitatory states aren't ideal for learning.
What do you mean by hyperexcitatory?
Well, I guess from a biochemical perspective, it might be like endless bursts of glutamate, or essentially when neurons are excited, is that informing our ability to be focused and listen?
For sure. It's just which neurons are being excited.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
So it's
enough.
not, it's not black and white.
Yeah.
This is the common misconception of what's happening in the brain, is that it's not black and white at all. It's very much all gray.
Yeah.
Right. Except when we're talking about fear.
Uh-huh.
And except when we're talking about safety. That's when things, obviously there's a spectrum in between,
Sure.
but there is a very, very black and white discerning amygdala that says, you're under threat. You are not allowed to take resources and send them to your reproductive system right now. Right. You're not allowed to take my resources and send them to the immune system. I'm taking those.
Right.
And those are going to the skeletal muscle so you can run if you need to. But that means that when you multiply that times time, thinking about illness and the relationship between stress and illness, you take that amount of resource allocation that's going on, it really reframes illness as a resource allocation problem.
Yeah.
Right. Our amygdala is exploited by society and all the responsibilities and all the things that are going on and everything we've been taught to be overactive in detecting newness as threat.
Yeah.
Right. But newness is, and diversity and difference from us are literally the thing that enriches the quality of our lives more than anything else, universally speaking. So we're now accidentally trained, or accidentally in that we did not choose to train ourselves to, generally speaking, to perceive the thing that makes our lives rich, the source of the richness in our lives, as threatening. That is confusing for us.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we start to think about the amygdala, it's not saying you're afraid. It's saying, watch out. There's something that's unfamiliar to you around the corner that's in this area. Right. And maybe that's an actual threat, but maybe it's just somebody you've never met before. Maybe it's something about yourself that you didn't know you knew before, right? It could be any of the above. Then we have the ability to literally retrain that part by remembering one of the common sentiments that comes from things like ketamine-assisted therapy or MDMA-assisted therapy or profound meditative states, which is that we're all human first. Before we're anything else, before we are black, white, yellow, green, whatever, or before we wear the clothes that we're wearing. And we're all human. And if we're all human, then we, by definition, have a heck of a lot more in common than we do different. Like infinitely more.
Yeah. Like
Right?
our DNA, what is it? It's like 99.99
99 whatever percent the same.
Yeah.
And we have the same fundamental wants, needs, and desires. We all want air, water, food, shelter, connection, and acceptance by our community, right? And to feel like some part of something bigger. We all want that. So if we can admit that we all want that and we all want to feel safe and in control most of the time, then we can give that to each other for free without actually, and help each other feel safe without actually like requiring anything in return other than just that safety.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's something we can give to each other for free. The reason I'm in business is because people forgot how to give that to each other. So they pay me, you know, but literally any of us can do that for each other. And now it's about relearning how to do that. And psychedelic medicines and things like Apollo that we developed are to help do this. It's about helping people feel safe enough in their own skin. So not just in the office, but in their day-to-day lives, so that they can say, oh, wait, actually that fear response, that amygdala is blasting off. It's telling me I should be afraid right now. Well, I'm not running from a lion.
Yeah.
There's nothing around the corner that's about to get me. Why do I this, you know, you can settle down, bro. It's okay.
Right. Yeah, but modernity tends to hijack the amygdala, and here we are in incessant sympathetic overload, and that has all sorts of endocrine knock-on impacts and metabolic knock-on impacts, et cetera. And so, I mean, you look at the correlation or relationship between stress and mental disorders and physiological disorders. I mean, they're like
hand in hand.
They're hand in hand. In fact, they're really not any different, you know, in some ways. And so, you know, I think what is again reassuring is that there are a whole variety of modalities and protocols that we can adopt to essentially move ourselves into parasympathetic safety.
Right.
And in some ways, they're very intuitive. That doesn't mean they're easy to do. In fact, they're very difficult to adopt sometimes. But if you think about like, what is fight or flight like? What is it like to be in that state? Oh, okay. Well, my respiratory rate is going up. I'm breathing, you know, I'm breathing really quickly. Well, the breath is this incredible tool that doesn't always have to be involuntary. In fact, you know, we have conscious control over our breath such that we can almost trick ourselves back into a parasympathetic state. So maybe unpack, you can talk about breath, but you can also talk about touch and other different kinds of protocols that we can consciously adopt that can then change over time our bottom-up habits.
So it starts with three things, which are the thinking about the understanding of what it means to feel safe, which is for us to feel in control, and to know that we're in control of certain things. The second thing is to actually do the thing that makes us and reminds us that we're in control. And the third thing is to actually feel it and then rinse and repeat. Okay. So this is based on sort of a very well understood cognitive behavioral therapy framework, which is the relationship between our thoughts, understanding, behaviors, and feeling. So if you think about anxiety, just to break anxiety down into the risk of being called a reductionist, what I will say is that most anxiety that we experience in our day-to-day lives comes from spending our limited time. We only have, if you imagine, we only have however much time we're awake each day, we have 100% of that available to pay attention to stuff, right? If we choose to pay attention to stuff that we don't have control over during that time, say 70% of that time, like what other people think about us, which we don't have control over, or what we could have done, what we did, how we're upset about something we did the day before, or what have you, then we are ensuring that we feel out of control 70% of the time or more. And if we spend that time in turn recognizing that we can choose to pay attention to things we do have control over, like our breath in any moment, movement, physical movement in any moment, soothing touch, applying soothing touch to yourself. We can do it in any moment, or what we listen to, our attention, and music, song, right? These things we can do in any moment. All of a sudden, we feel in control that much more of the time, which then makes us feel safe. So it's really, which then tells our amygdala that, hey, you're safe enough to feel in control right now. You're safe enough to feel this breath. You're safe enough to give attention to that breath or this movement or this song or this feeling in your body. You can't possibly be running from a lion in this moment. If you were running from a lion, this is the critical understanding of the hardwired, what can't be bent or what can't be broken, right?
Yeah.
What's hardwired is going to take over. Because we've evolved it over millions and millions of years, it is not going away. So if we were actually under real survival threat, you best believe your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick on and not allow you to be thinking about how attracted you are to your predator right now, right? This is a very real thing. And so that understanding what's hardwired in that way is because, being attracted to our predator would lead to certain demise, right?
Yeah.
Our bodies are hardwired to not do that.
Stockholm syndrome or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, right. Yeah. Well, that's the human version, right?
Right.
Where we take a lot of time to convince somebody that their predator or their captive, they are who they're captive to is actually somebody that they are very respectful of,
Right.
which is very interesting. But it's this idea that, we have control over a lot more than we think we do. And it's the feeling of being out of control that drives fear, which then drives us to make impulsive, selfish decisions, which is that culture element you were talking about.
Yeah.
So we have the ability, and only we have the ability to remind ourselves that we are safe because we're in control of how we feel in this moment. If we can regulate our nervous system by taking a deep breath or moving at all, doing a dance, listening to a song, putting some touch on your body, feeling your Apollo, whatever it is, any of those four things, touch, music, listening, movement, and breath, you can literally switch the resources in the nervous system over to the parasympathetic recovery side in as little as seconds. It just takes a little practice.
Mm-hmm.
And just by starting to do that, you recondition and rewire your own nervous system. And that creates the fertile soil for neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah.
Because you're reminding the body that it's safe enough to learn. I'm safe enough to listen to what I want to listen to right now, not what the environment is telling me it needs my attention. Maybe it doesn't need my attention. Maybe I need my attention to be focused on Jeff right now.
Yeah. Or you're focused on expansion, or you're in a state that allows for expansion versus preservation.
Exactly.
And I'll say you sound like if Marcus Aurelius was a neuroscientist. I got pretty into Stoicism for a while, and essentially what you're outlining is the central tenet of Stoicism. And it's even reflected in, there's like a lot of Christian theology that was built upon Stoicism. So the Reinhold Niebuhr Serenity Prayer is essentially exactly what you're talking about, is focusing on the things that you can control.
Mm-hmm.
And then also
very old stuff.
Yeah.
Very old stuff.
Absolutely.
Neuroscience just catching up.
But in order to, for example, like adopt a meditation practice, where you can witness phenomena arising moment to moment in a field of awareness and not, fixate or identify with it, et cetera, you need to be in a certain, already in a pre-existing state of some degree of stability. It's hard to tell someone who has, severe depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or et cetera to, meditate, to be honest.
Right. Because a quiet mind for them, or the idea or concept of a quiet mind, if they can even remember what that feels like, is often not a safe place for them. Right. If you have thoughts that are negative about yourself, you've been telling yourself, that come up in your mind every time you quiet your mind.
Right.
How safe do you feel with a quiet mind? You probably run from it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there was a paper that came out, which I believe was titled "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," which is a sort of a very poetic title for a science paper. essentially, what it pointed to was that the highest rates of self-reported well-being, of happiness, were associated with someone's capability to conjoin their thoughts and actions. Essentially, that what you're thinking about is also yoked with what you are doing. And the misalignment of those things tends to lead to a lot of dissatisfaction and frustration and unhappiness. But of course, how many of us have incessant monkey mind, right? I mean, even if we're thinking about something that's wonderful, it's still disconnected from the thing that we're doing. So like Thich Nhat Hanh has the famous poem, when you do the dishes, because that is a window into happiness and contentment. And you're here, all here right now in the everlasting present. But, it's easy for, thoughts to be branches and people to be monkeys swinging riotously from one to the other. And, the research points to the fact that phenomenon leads to a great deal of unhappiness and suffering. So, how can we become more mindful to be in a state of non-judgmental sacred presence? Okay, that's maybe a little easier for me that has sort of the disposable time to think about even the concept. But, for many people, some other forms of invasive therapy are necessary, that it's not just going to happen from protocols that are like meditation or, let's say, nutrition, which is a huge one. And we could probably talk about the relationship between nutrition and mental health for a good 40 hours. And maybe we will, but not today. So let's talk about, specific kinds of more invasive therapy. I'm not sure that's really the best chosen word, but
the next level up.
What's that?
The next level up from the things you can do on your own.
Yeah. So let's talk about ketamine-assisted therapy specifically, because I know that it's an area of focus for you, and it's legal.
It's the only legal psychedelic medicine currently for use by clinicians.
Which is huge, because even though there's, I think, plenty of opportunity for experimentation around the edges of things, that you're going to get like regulated dosages and all this kind of stuff, which we'll get into.
There's a lot of safety associated with that.
So give us a little primer on ketamine and the history of ketamine and where it came from and how it was typically been used.
So I can't give you the full story, but I can tell you that it was synthesized for the first time, I believe, in 1956. It was used subsequently as an anesthetic and found to have very potent anesthetic properties, so relieving of pain. Right. Physical pain was the focus originally, and trying to understand, and basically in an effort to create new pain-relieving molecules that were that didn't have as much risk of suppressing respiration.
Right, as opiates or something like that.
Right, opiates, and opiates combined with alcohol, for instance, will dramatically suppress respiration and results in a lot of overdose. Right. And then also, of course, the traditional anesthetics, like the inhaled anesthetics that we use in surgery that we don't know how they work, haven't for over 100 years, but they knock you out. Propofol knocks you out, stops breathing, right? That stuff is useful for certain things, but they're also harsh. They can have a lot of, withdrawal effects people have when they come back into their bodies afterwards. And ketamine was a nice discovery because it's kind of a very, very fast acting, relative, considering the risk profile of anesthetics, extremely safe. You can carry it around in a syringe. And when, the first major use case of it, major, in addition to the operating room, it was used in Vietnam and during war to, pop soldiers who were really injured so that they didn't freak out, because any good medic knows that if your patient is on the table or in the field and they are really worried about surviving, then their chances of survival go way down. And if they are feeling calm and breathing at a lower level and their metabolism goes down, then their chances of survival go way up. Their chances of bleeding out go way down. And so we want people to be calm, going back to the stress pathway and survival. And so ketamine ended up going through that pathway for a very long time and becoming a commonplace anesthetic pre-surgery for patients who were vulnerable populations, in large part women, pregnant women, children. Horses are very gentle creatures that require very gentle anesthesia because they don't recover well from standard anesthesia and things like that. Common animal anesthetic and common human anesthetic for vulnerable populations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it got the rap for a while as being sort of a horse sedative, right? And so,
right, but in the context that horses would require like more than us, or require like a stronger thing. Horses are some of the most gentle, empathetic animals that we interact with on a regular basis. So for them, they actually needed something that was much more gentle than what we typically use with humans, which is why we move towards it. And why it's commonplace. But I think that down the road in the 90s, in particular, ketamine was found, and I think it was observed before that, but in the 90s, it started to become more commonly observed as have antidepressant effects after being administered, and even psychedelic or mind altering, effects along the lines of revealing people's subconscious to themselves, which is in a lot of ways, that's sort of what psychedelic means, is to reveal the mind. So ketamine was found down, 30, 40 years after its discovery to actually have effects like that, and then found to be helpful for depression, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I love the etymology of psychedelics, the psyche, which is mind, and what is it? Delos is to show or something?
To show, to reveal.
Yeah.
Such a good name.
It's such a good name. It's a powerful analgesic, and I think it was the official description of it, at least one of the early official descriptions of it, was a dissociative anesthetic.
Right.
So anesthetic, we have a general sense of what that means. What does dissociative mean?
So dissociative refers to, in this case, almost like a separation between mind and body. So if we can accept that in general, even though we may perceive them as separate, the mind and body are actually intimately interconnected, and they are constantly talking to each other on a regular moment-to-moment basis. That's so seamless that we don't even realize it's happening, right? Our mind is naturally regulating our body's blood flow, breath rate, heart rate, blood pressure, everything, all at the same time that we're having this conversation without thinking about it. So intimately interconnected. Now, all of a sudden, you take a dissociative anesthetic like ketamine, and now your mind and body are dissociated, which means that they're still interacting with each other, but there's almost like a delay between the interaction. There's like the brakes are put on a little bit so that they can almost experience each other as separate parts of the same thing. And I think that it almost, again, we don't fully understand this aspect of ketamine, but it seems that, and we don't understand the molecular pathways either completely. It seems to be partially related probably to glutamate, to opiate receptor activation, and to probably serotonin and dopamine as well. And it is creating a dissociation, a separation from pain. So in a way, what we talk about when we say dissociative anesthetic is emotional pain and physical pain, contrary to popular opinion, are basically doing the same thing in the brain.
Yeah.
Right? They look the same. They generally have the same impact if not addressed. And ketamine dissociates our identity, who we know ourselves to be, from the pain. So you can experience myself, pain, separate.
Yeah.
Right?
You can become the witness.
Right. And if you can become the witness, then you can understand what is modifiable in this situation and what is not, right? What can I change? What is my body doing because it's hardwired to do that? And what control do I have over the way I'm experiencing this thing? I interpreted as part of me possibly for decades.
Right. Is dissociation related to hallucination in any way?
I don't really like the word hallucination.
Good.
I rarely use it. I think that it is a word that implies to most people that they're perceiving something that isn't real.
Right.
And I would argue that when you are in the experience with medicine or dreams or what have you, that we can hardly say that what people are experiencing is not real.
No.
It's just a different part of the experience, right? It's all there. It's all material. It's accessible.
Yeah.
Normally, we're just
Yeah,
not tuned into it.
Yeah, and it falls outside of social convention.
And we're not taught. We're not taught how to listen to it, right? Like maybe you have a glowing colored aura around you that I've seen some people train themselves to be able to witness and describe it and draw it and even photograph it, but I can't see it because I've never learned to. But maybe it's still there.
It's still there. Or maybe just our spatial instruments are too limited. You know,
also
we could say the sky is blue on a cloudless day, and that is a very lovely way to get along. You know, it's a social institution, but we see across a tiny sliver of the visible light of the light spectrum, and blue light happens to be somewhere around 400 nanometers or something like that. So yeah, the sky is blue, but that's just an intersubjective agreement.
Exactly.
And when we are able to transcend the limitations of our five senses in, let's say, a psychedelic state, well, then, we are perceiving things outside of the realm of our five senses, but we don't have a vocabulary for that. We don't have any training for that. And so it seems like a quote unquote hallucination.
Right.
It seems like it's not real.
Right.
But it might be the closest thing we get to objective reality. We don't really know.
Right.
What I do know is that what's happening here is more or less a subjective reality. So anyways, as far as
but an agreed to one.
Yeah,
mutually
absolutely
agreed to that you said earlier, which is really important.
Yeah.
That's interesting because we can tune to other versions of this or other aspects of it rather, right? If we consider reality to be infinite and consciousness itself to be infinite, and that our awareness of it is maybe the tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water, then what's beneath the surface? 100 billion more of these tips that we're not aware of. So then when you add in something like ketamine, say you've been engaging in some strange behavior your whole life, which is every time I hear certain loud noises like traffic or jackhammers, I really want an ice cream, and now it's made me very fat and pre-diabetic, right? And because I can't resist, I've like highly trained this thing because that's what soothes me as a kid, and you don't even realize that it's a problem. You're just like, I don't know why I've gained so much weight. But really you're just living in an area where now you're more noisy and more disturbed and more restless, and that leads you to eat more ice cream, and it's all completely beneath the surface of the water. And then you administer something like ketamine, and ketamine tunes your filter, our consciousness filter, that little part above the surface of the water that just aims it a little bit differently, right? And now all of a sudden you're beneath the surface of the water is more illuminated, and you could see, oh, there was something that happened in my childhood where I had a bunch of really uncomfortable experiences in loud, noisy areas, and my parents just took me to get ice cream, and that's what made me feel better. So now I have this association that I never realized I had before. I don't need to do that. I'm safe in these environments, right?
Yeah.
And then you literally create a window of opportunity to question the way you were doing things enough to recognize that you can choose a different path.
Yeah. I think what's interesting there is that we think of memory as something that has happened in the past, sort of this irrecoverable condition or something. And, but of course, every memory, every experience of the past is happening in the present.
Mm-hmm.
So as we rekindle that memory in our field of awareness, it's labile in essence. So we can, and by that I mean we can reshape our understanding and perception and association with it. But again, as we spoke about before, our five senses really anchor us to the default mode network because they are because of the biological imperative, because of many, many, many good reasons.
Yeah,
but
they're
now,
the ways we were taught to take in information.
That's right. But now here we are, with a ketamine infusion, and all of a sudden we're not necessarily relying just on our normal five senses, which underwrite the default mode network, we're actually roaming around a whole other kind of consciousness that's not spotlight in nature. Now, it might not be floodlight in nature either, but we've been able to move the spotlight, into what might have been a darker and more shadowy part of our psyche,
or the opposite,
or
right?
the
Or
opposite.
something that's like your light and your source of joy and meaning in the world, right?
Yeah.
The point is you can shine it anywhere, and if you can shine it anywhere, then we need to be all that more careful when we step into that psychedelic realm where we're intentional with how we want what we want to experience, and that we're intentional knowing that when we go underneath the surface that anything could pop up. So surround yourself with the support and ideally the guides that you need to make sure that when things pop up that maybe you weren't anticipating, that you are prepared to navigate it, right? It's just like going on a underwater dive in a foreign territory, right?
Yeah.
Have a rope tied to yourself so that somebody can pull you out if you get in a place that you're not comfortable navigating.
Yeah. Well, you're a more than adept buoy for people. And that we'll get into kind of the protocol of the therapy itself. I do want to just pry at the action of mechanism of ketamine to the degree that we can understand it. So, sort of the popular wisdom is that it blocks the NMDA receptor, essentially the glutamate receptor. How valid is that? Is that just kind of popular science, or just sort of skimming the surface, or what's going on there on a biochemical level?
It's hard to say because ketamine is such a diverse substance. It's one of the psychedelic. I mean, interestingly enough, it's one of the psychedelic medicines that we know the least about its mechanism, but it is exquisitely safe, which is nice. And has very few side effects when used at the doses we use it at, but it is definitely a complex mechanism. Most of the other psychedelic medicines that we know of that we were talking about specifically activate the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor as maybe the first line down the path of receptors. The ketamine is acting at NMDA, so that's definitely happening. It's acting at the opiate receptor, which seems to be really important despite what most people thought. There was a big study that came out of Stanford that was very, very fascinating. I'm trying to think when it was, maybe 10 years ago now, that showed that if you administer naltrexone or naloxone, which is an opioid receptor blocker, to somebody who's experiencing ketamine, similar to the study that we talked about with administering a 5-HT2A receptor blocker and experiencing a psilocybin or LSD, that the opioid receptor blocker blocked almost all the effects of ketamine.
Really?
So, but ketamine's not that active at the opioid receptor compared to opiates or any other molecule that activates that receptor. It's actually a relatively weak activator of that receptor. So why would that be at the top of the chain? So we really don't know. We know that it is a multi-pronged mechanism of action. It is one of the most mysterious of all of the psychedelics in terms of mechanism. We know more about things like ayahuasca, in fact, than we know about ketamine in terms of mechanism. It does induce one thing that's interesting, though. What we do know is whatever it's doing, molecularly speaking, it's increasing neurogenesis and neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
Probably by two methods, one of which, and maybe three, maybe all three methods we mentioned earlier: neurogenesis, making new neurons, which we've some early data to show, not me personally, but there is early data to show in lab studies that ketamine is inducing making of new neurons, which is pretty amazing because not that much does that other than psilocybin and some other psychedelic medicines. And then it also increases the growing or regrowth of dendritic spines, which is the repair of old and dying neurons. And it also increases the formation of new connections between neurons, synaptogenesis. So that's really the triple threat of optimizing learning is hit by ketamine, which is, and possibly other psychedelics as well. But it's just fascinating to see that you can do that, and ketamine can do that, and in some cases without a person involved. So some of these studies were done in cells in culture, right? So
Really?
with just molecule alone added onto cells at the right dose, you can induce the regrowth of
Synapses,
stem cells.
nerves. Yeah, because we're taught that after age 25 or so, we don't really produce new neurons. But
We were taught that.
We were taught that.
Unless they want to be produced.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Apparently. Okay. So, why did we get so preoccupied with serotonin when glutamate seems to be the primary neurotransmitter across synapses in the brain?
I think we honestly don't know what the primary neurotransmitter is.
Mm-hmm.
I think serotonin may very well be the one that
Mhm.
we're starting to see because of all the concerted action around meaning making
Mm-hmm.
and some of the studies we're starting to see in the psychedelic world around serotonin being this essential critical receptor to meaning making and to emotion regulation. And, what is life without meaning,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, literally meaning is at the center of everything we do and everything we know and why, and potentially even how intense it gets entrained, right? Because we know from just day-to-day life that things that are more meaningful, we remember more,
That's right.
right? So if we remember it more, then that must mean that we have stronger connections around those things, which must mean that those neurons are changing their epigenetic code more for meaningful experiences. We can draw that correlation. It's not known that that's actually what's happening yet,
Yeah.
but I think there's a really interesting theory to think about how we understand how the brain is actually rewiring and retraining itself through these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that learning is something we can do at any time in our lives.
Is there any relationship between ketamine, its relationship with glutamate, and, for example, the triggering or activation of certain pathways like mTOR? So this is getting pretty much in the weeds here, but essentially mammalian targeted rapamycin, which is known as essentially a cellular growth pathway. Does that pathway need to be activated in order to reify neurobiogenesis?
It's hard to say because there's also studies that have shown that there are benefits of people taking in animals with rapamycin, right? Which I think is an mTOR inhibitor.
I know.
So it's interesting. That's why I think that the glutamate system is interesting, but it's not. It's so. I think what we've seen in neuroscience is the glutamate is so much everywhere that it's like the water. Right? Like we know it's water to humans, it's water to animals. We know it's fundamental, or the air. It's fundamental for life. So it's kind of boring to study because it's so ubiquitous throughout the brain and body that it's just the default positive excitatory neurochemical communicator molecule.
Right.
Whereas serotonin is more like the rare, specially prepared feast that you would have on a very specific day that gives you that unique experience around feeling really special in an experience, right? So it's more along the lines of it's not used in every single neural interaction. It's used in very specific neural interactions around mood and around meaningfulness. And that it's similar to calcium in the brain around oxidative stress. Calcium, and it's such an interesting molecule because it's so common, and yet there's this huge discrepancy between how much calcium is outside the cell versus inside, which allows these tiny shifts in calcium level by, for example, activating a serotonin receptor to cause dramatic downstream changes in the cell. Like dramatic, game-changing, even to the point of death if there's slightly too much calcium.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting that where we can, it's not to say that it's not a competition, right? It's hard to say which one's more important. They're both important. We need both to live and to live well, but that serotonin may be more critical in the specific pathway around meaning, whereas glutamate may be more important around just day-to-day functioning of neurons.
Yeah. So let me traverse the terrain neurotransmitters just one last moment here and talk about gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, as a player kind of in this cocktail. So GABA is, well, the uptake of GABA has been kind of the target of benzodiazepines for a very, very long time. So that the more GABA hits the GABA receptors, the greater sort of decrease in the levels of anxiety. What is the relationship here kind of in this mix with GABA?
So GABA is a neurotransmitter and neurotransmitter system. It's also very complex, similar to glutamate. It would be like the equivalent of glutamate being everywhere and it's excitatory. GABA is everywhere and it's inhibitory.
Yeah.
And so it's important for complementing glutamate activity by regulating the up and down with glutamate. Glutamate is the up and GABA is the down. So certain GABAergic molecules can turn the brain down when we want it to turn down, like alcohol is a GABAergic molecule. Benzodiazepines in a lot of ways were like oral pills that give a similar effect as alcohol. Similar sedative GABAergic response. Barbiturates are kind of similar. And they're just generally sedating, but the problem is they're sedating globally speaking. So it's not like you just get a burst of GABA naturally in a specific part of the brain. And naturally that's what you're getting the effect to get this particular outcome you want. But when you take a benzodiazepine, you're getting global GABA stimulation. So that's like the whole brain is suppressed in activity, which is why you get unintended consequences with alcohol and benzos and barbiturates and generally sedatives and hypnotics, like impaired judgment, impaired intuition, impaired insight, being able to look inside yourself and be self-aware, impaired ability to be empathetic because your sensation is tuned down. Your ability to listen is turned down when you have sedatives like benzodiazepines on board. So the GABA system, so the glutamate system is really important for listening and turning certain listening parts of the brain on is one way to think about it. And turning on judgment, if we want judgment, turning on insight, if we want insight, turning on empathy, it needs to be fed glutamate as well as other neurotransmitters to activate those parts of the brain. When you take something like a benzodiazepine, it's just turning all of that off for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Which can be very useful when you're treating a seizure or a disorder of overactive brain activity.
Right.
It could be very, very dangerous when people are taking it chronic, daily, over long periods of time, and they don't realize because their insight's impaired.
Okay, so let's talk about protocols for the administration of ketamine. So I guess the first question I would have is what are the different methods of delivery and what are the benefits of various different methods? Let's start there.
So ketamine is interesting because, again, as the only real legal psychedelic medicine that we have, it can be administered in lots of different ways. And traditionally, it was administered by anesthesiologists who were giving it IV intravenously or intramuscularly through injection. It was not traditionally given orally or intranasally. Right. But over the years, there's been more intranasal and oral formulations that have come out that allow for absorption through the mouth. And there's very poor gut absorption for ketamine. So unfortunately and unfortunately, because ketamine it's been legal for so long and the toxicity profile is fairly well understood and it's, fairly low risk in comparison to everything else that is out there, that it is often administered in the easiest way, but it's not the way that gets the best outcomes, which would be administering it without psychotherapy. Okay. And because it's a psychedelic, it naturally, psychedelic aside, even SSRIs are proven to work better with psychotherapy, right? So psychedelic aside, any medicine pretty much that's used for treatment of a mental illness, any medicine pretty much has shown in studies it works better when accompanied by psychotherapy than medicine alone.
Right. So you want to wrap some form of psychotherapy, talk therapy around the infusion of ketamine. And so you want to really avoid self-administration unless you need small doses to kind of carry you from therapy to therapy. But we can get to that.
Yeah, there's different ways to approach it, right? I think that going back and taking it all the way back to what we started this conversation about, which was, understanding the serotonin pathway and why we use medicines that we use, like Zoloft and Prozac. What we're talking about is that ketamine, that all of these medicines have been shown, when used to treat whatever mental illness they're treating, to have better outcomes with psychotherapy. So it's not argued. When you're entering into the psychedelic space, you start to see that people will administer medicine because ketamine has these natural effects that just come from the medicine alone. For instance, you can inject somebody, which is often seen, particularly in high acuity settings, you can inject somebody with ketamine who is severely depressed and even suicidal. And for a couple weeks afterwards, they'll be no longer depressed and no longer suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
How amazing is that, right? But if you rely on the medicine and just schedule that person for a 2-week ketamine injection every 2 weeks, you're not actually getting to the root of the problem, right? You're really just creating another crutch.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how amazing the medicine is. It doesn't matter whether it's an SSRI you take every day or an amphetamine you take every day, or whether it's an incredible medicine like ketamine that can radically reverse outcomes in these illnesses. If it's administered in a way that's habitual, it will become we will become reliant on it. We will externalize the healer to the medicine and to the person delivering it, rather than to internalize it to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So this fundamental philosophy around healing really goes back to Hippocrates and goes back to ancient Eastern traditions about, again, the healer being in us. And so then the medicine with ketamine is activating that. It's turning off the default mode network slightly, turning on our observer mind slightly, and allowing us to observe ourselves for who we are and observe the opportunity for growth that's in front of us, and that we can choose to do things differently.
Right. And that's where it becomes much more highly effective to have a guide or a Sherpa
Exactly.
shepherding you through that new state of being, essentially.
Right. Because you can equally learn, if you're increasing neuroplasticity non-specifically, right, you could equally learn maladaptive coping strategies by accident, like medicine reliance. It's just a very simple example. If you don't understand how the medicine works and you start to rely on the medicine for the outcome, then you learn medicine reliance, and that's what you're teaching your brain to do. Whereas what we want to be teaching the brain to do is how to recreate the experience the medicine is giving us without the medicine.
Right.
Important caveat.
So as a guide, is it appropriate to introduce, let's say, a negative memory within the context of a ketamine therapy, such that, people are coming at the memory from a new headspace in order to reframe it? Or is that sort of dangerous waters there?
That's an interesting thought. I've actually never really thought about it that way before, but I can see why you might think that would be something that we would do. It's kind of like exposure, right? You expose somebody to something that they might find threatening.
Yeah, with a new headspace.
With a new headspace.
Yeah.
So I think what we often take is a similar, but what we call non-directive approach, because ultimately what we've seen and what we teach in the psychedelic healing space with ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, and going back again to the indigenous practices around ayahuasca and other ancient plant medicines, mescaline, peyote, etc. Whatever was meant to come up will come up, right? Whatever needs to be addressed will be addressed, because our emotions are latent underneath the surface. So the surface may appear calm of the water underneath the tip of the iceberg, right? The surface may appear calm, but it's actually very restless under there. And there's a lot going on. And there's a lot that wants to be addressed, that wants to be acknowledged, and wants to be brought in as part of the whole. But we don't necessarily know which parts are going to show their face right away. And so that's where this guidance is so critical, because we want to have an intentional process by which we open ourselves up to allow only the things that are the most meaningful to us and the most helpful to address. And we don't always have control. We don't know what's going to come up. Anything could come up, right? So a lot of it is really just preparing someone that for anything, right? It's just you. And if it's just you, there's nothing to be afraid of. So let's work with that.
Yeah. Just hovering over delivery method for a moment, is it more optimal to deliver intravenously versus intranasally or through kind of oral sublingually, just in order to have greater control over dosage? And as it pertains to dosage, is there generally like a, what would you call it, like a bolus up front, or is the dosage kind of spread out over the duration of the therapy?
There's a lot of nuance to it, right?
Yeah.
So I think the goal that a lot of people think of is when you're talking about ketamine. So, and it's also, there's a lot of disagreement around it, right? There's even people who believe if you think about how 80 to 90%, maybe 90+% of the people who currently administer ketamine in the US, over 1,000 providers probably now, are not providing psychotherapy with the medicine. Okay, so let's start out there.
Well, they're not psychotherapists.
There
might be anesthesiologists
they might even be
pain management.
And they might even
people.
be psychiatrists who never learned therapy, because that was also common for a long time, going back to what we were talking about earlier with Thomas Detry and the eradication of the psychoanalytic model, bringing in the molecular medicine model of psychiatry. They threw out and tossed out a lot of the psychoanalysts and psychotherapists who didn't want to buy in 100% to the molecular model. Right. Turns out, what do we now know? It's actually the combination of both. It's where both the molecular model and the psychotherapeutic model interface.
Of course it is.
Holy cow, right? That's where the answer is, right?
Yeah.
That's where the opportunity therein lies to potentially use the cure word for mental illness, because we're actually getting to the core. We're using the medicines respectfully in the way they were meant to be used to actually get to the core of the problem. And so when we're talking about all of these different ways ketamine can be administered, well, what are you trying to get out of it, right? Are you trying to, if you talk to those 90% of people who administer ketamine who are not doing therapy, they'll tell you in large part that the psychedelic effects of the ketamine are a side effect of the experience, not the healing effect. Whereas I would say, and anybody who does a psychotherapy, I think, would say that it's potently healing to have these psychedelic mind-revealing experiences.
Right.
But there's still a lot of debate in the field. And so then the question becomes, well, what's actually happening? Do you care about having this huge peak state for an hour from an IM experience or an IV experience? Or do you care about having a low level all the time from an intranasal, and then we don't really know. So then what do we look at? We look at abuse rates. We look at dosing frequency. We look at side effect rates, and side effects are relatively low for ketamine, but people who use intranasal tend to abuse it more.
Right.
And so we try not to use that as much.
Right. So there's an intranasal that was developed by Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, I guess it is. That's S-ketamine, right? So is there any real distinction between S-ketamine and R-ketamine and just ketamine?
Yeah. So most ketamine is S and R combined, which is called racemic ketamine. Because the way, and this is going back to like the early days of organic chemistry. So we're what all organic molecules have a mirror image of each other.
Right.
And when they exist in nature, in almost every circumstance, they exist in equal parts, left and right, R and S parts. Each mirror image is roughly 50-50. And one of those mirror images of the molecule might be more active in certain ways at the receptor site than the other mirror image. So it turns out that racemic ketamine, which is typical ketamine that we'd get from a pharmacy, would have equal parts R and S. And then S-ketamine is just the S part.
Right.
And they're both equally effective with the difference that the S part, the S-ketamine that's S alone, has a slightly higher potency. So you can give lower dose to get the same effects that you would get with racemic ketamine, but it also costs 10 times as much. So in most cases, we still, and most providers still just use racemic general ketamine.
And was S-ketamine somewhat of a ploy for the pharmaceutical industry to get in on ketamine? I mean,
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a pharmaceutical company, it's a no-brainer, right? That's their whole business model is on patenting novel compounds. And if you can find one of those miraculous novel compounds, it's actually a derivative of an existing compound, you're in business. That's like a cash cow.
Yeah. And is it easier to control the dissociative components of the trip if you're administering intravenously, for example. So you can kind of like, if someone has a little bit of discomfort around dissociation, that you can kind of pull back or, press the accelerator or whatever. Or is it pretty minimal? That's pretty nuanced at this juncture.
I mean, I would say that honestly, if the best thing to do is prepare someone for whatever's going to come up.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't necessarily know how much somebody's going to dissociate. And most people who are experiencing ketamine are nonverbal during the experience. They can talk, but they're not actively communicating with you the whole time. And they might feel like they're in another world, or they might have forgotten what words are, how to use them, or how to flap their mouth holes. So, you're not necessarily going to get an accurate feedback from somebody. I think the unfortunate part about IV, even though it's used frequently, is that most people who have an IV in their arm are not feeling free to move around.
Right.
And sometimes with ketamine or any psychedelic medicine, when people are under the influence of it, they want to freely move because our bodies store energy and they store tension. And as soon as you are in a place where you mentally recognize there's a certain part of your body that's storing energy or tension, energy in the form of tension around some feeling or some event, like something that made you sad 10 years ago, and you realize that's being stored in the middle of your back, you're going to do every single thing you can in that moment to stretch that part of your back out. Right. And if you have an IV in your arm, you can't do that.
Right.
So I think the movement aspect of the psychedelic experience is extremely therapeutic. I think the body element of it is extremely therapeutic. It's underutilized in the experience. We don't do that much with it, but in IV, it's completely ignored in general. With IM, I think the best way to experience ketamine, if there was one best way, would be intramuscular. Yeah. Because you can just get an injection in your arm. You just get one injection, and then within 3 to 5 minutes, you're at the peak state. So you're in peak for almost the entire hour of the experience, or hour and a half, and then you come down and you're out of the peak experience, and you gradually come back into your body, and you're fine. And then with oral works very well, and that would be my close second choice to intramuscular. But oral, you have to swish it in your mouth, and then you only absorb 30% of what you swish. Right. And so then it takes longer. So it's a longer onset, like 20 minutes, 25 minutes sometimes, just to get to peak. Then when you're at peak, you're at peak for half hour, and then it fades out afterwards.
Got it. So less bioavailable orally.
Right.
But there's an ease of use, and there's also the freedom of movement. And then, as you say, intramuscularly might be the best way if you can do it that way.
If you can get to it. But it doesn't outweigh the benefits of if you can't get to a good intramuscular provider, it's better to just get a qualified clinician to have a pharmacy send you oral ketamine at home. Almost, I would say like 80% of the patients we see that we do ketamine therapy with are all telemedicine patients. So they are at home in the comfort of their home with somebody else there to take care of them if they need a little help to the bathroom or something. And we teach them how to self-administer the medicine. Going back to what you brought up earlier, is that you can self-administer it. So that solves a huge access to care problem. And you can teach people how to do it at home over Zoom, and then they can do it on their own after by repeating what we taught them. Literally just doing the same setup, same comfy location setup, same music, same smell, same whatever, right? Same intentions. And they can do it over and over and over again to the point where you get 6 or 12 doses over the course of several months. And then people can actually start to achieve, with a relatively short amount of time in therapy and just 6 to 12 doses of medicine, symptom remission, which is pretty outstanding.
It's unreal. So let me ask you just about ideal duration. So you mentioned an hour. I've seen 40 minutes. I've seen 90 minutes. Is there a Goldilocks zone there?
I mean, it just depends on how much medicine you get and the way you absorb it.
But there's no optimal.
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, I would say in general, oral experiences take longer because there's a longer on and a longer off time. Intramuscular injection and IV experiences, you can literally, it's on and then it's off. So it's much easier to do those experiences in an hour end to end and just have a little bit of recovery time afterwards than it is to do an oral experience that way, which requires more like 2.5 hours.
Got it. So if someone who has treatment-resistant depression comes to you and you engage in ketamine therapy, is there a frequency of dosage, Or does that completely depend on the case? Or
So it generally depends on the case, but I think that the evidence for treatment-resistant depression has shown so far that it's about 2 doses per week for 3 to 6 weeks. Tends to be the sweet spot. So that works out to be 6 to 12 doses within 3 to 6 weeks.
Okay.
And then you stop for a little bit and you do the therapy in between. Of course, there's lots of therapy in between, integration therapy. You do stop, and then I think what we do is we evaluate people and see where they're at over the next couple months without ketamine, doing the practices that we taught them that are reinforcing what they were experiencing on ketamine and how to sort of bring forth what they're learning from those experiences into their day-to-day lives, which is what we call integration. And then they take that, and then we evaluate again in a few months after the medicine stopped, and we determine if they need to do another course or not. Usually we see people do anywhere from 1 to 3 courses to get to where they want to go, but it just depends on the individual.
Yeah. And are there many contraindicators?
Not too many.
No.
I mean, for any psychedelic medicine in general, the contraindications are bipolar disorder, psychosis, delusional disorder, a family history of any of those things can be a contraindicator. And then, with ketamine, I think ketamine is interesting also because it's the most versatile of all the psychedelics. Because it doesn't directly impact the serotonin pathway, you can use it while taking an SSRI. You don't have to taper off of your Prozac or Zoloft or Paxil, which can be a really frustrating process to take ketamine. But you do for MDMA and psilocybin. Right. So that creates another barrier to access those medicines for people who already have depression. Lithium, which is used for bipolar disorder and mood stabilization, actually is thought to, in some papers, potentiate or extend the duration and the effects of ketamine. So that's also really interesting because people who have bipolar 2, which is not full swing bipolar, but sort of light hypomanic and times of where they're super high energy, but not to the point of self-destruction, and low energy, but not quite to the point of depression. Those people who are taking lithium can actually have better, longer lasting experiences with ketamine. And then some heart conditions, ketamine can lower seizure threshold. So we don't typically administer it to people who have seizure disorders, and it can, change. It can affect heart patterns at higher doses, but we don't see that at the lower doses. But we typically don't administer it to people who have severe arrhythmias or cardiovascular syndrome or
cirrhosis of the liver, probably, or
things like
pregnancy, maybe.
Pregnancy, actually, it is used for because it's gentle and it's not. Again, it does get passed through, but it's thought to be gentle enough that when pregnant women need to be put under for surgery, it's a lesser of the evils as far as anesthetics go to the fetal brain, which is interesting. So it is used, and in children it's used for anesthesia. So it is a very safe and useful molecule that's been very well studied, which is also why it's so fascinating. But that's also why, because it's new to the mental health space, there's not a lot of regulation or guidance around how to use it specifically for mental illness.
Right. And so what is the breadth of clinical research tell us now about the use of ketamine?
So currently, ketamine is only FDA approved for depression, treatment-resistant depression. And that's only as S-ketamine by Janssen in conjunction, the nasal spray, in conjunction with medication treatment, with treatment.
Oh, really? So that's the only thing that the FDA has approved at this juncture?
Currently, yes. But that was really just to open the door for S-ketamine to come in.
Right.
People have been using generic ketamine off-label for, decades.
And the FDA can't really say anything about off-label usage per se.
I mean, no, because it's approved for anesthesia, and it works really well for anesthesia, and it works really well at low doses for these other issues. So people can use them for these other issues. I think where we really see its powerful nature in terms of treatment is even depression, yes, but also in PTSD, and really helping, just like all psychedelic medicines seem to help with, is this reappraisal of self, right? And understanding that, hey, this idea of myself as a victim of circumstance, that's just an idea that I was taught by the experiences I had where maybe I wasn't supported. That's not my fault. It's actually separate from my identity. My identity is me, not victim me. Victim is a modifier to me that I learned to associate with me, right? If I'm not a victim, then I could actually be in control of my outcome, right? And then it starts this positive cascade down that path of thinking around, how do I restore myself? How do I remind myself that I'm actually in control? Breathing, movement, touch, music, getting lots of good sleep, controlling and making sure I put good, healthy stuff into my body, right? All of those things together, creating that milieu of safety, then helps us to retrain the brain by reactivating neuroplasticity in a very, I mean, it's happening anyway, but in the way we want it to be active, to learn things that are actually serving us.
Is it an audacious idea to start to consider the word cure in association with some of these therapies?
I think we have to aspire high, right? We have to aim high. Our field has been so challenged for and for so long, where for decades we've only been able to treat indefinitely, right? Where mental illness diagnosis was associated with a terminal illness. And I think what's so incredible about what's happening right now, when you look at the MDMA-assisted therapy studies and the psilocybin studies and the ketamine studies and even studies that we're having with wearable technology like Apollo, where we're actually able to see people do get better long-term. There are people getting better long-term. There are, in the MAP studies with MDMA, more people better at 1 year out than they were right after the treatment ended with no treatment in between.
Wow. So
how is that possible? It's really a paradigm shift in the way we look at mental health. And if you think about how it's possible that 67% of people at 1 year out could be better and only 53% at 2 months out, and there's no treatment in between, the only real answer is that makes sense is, well, we're teaching people how to heal themselves again, right? We're awakening that intuitive connection with ourselves that allows or reminds us how to do that work. And then we remember how to do that work and we remember how to treat ourselves well. All of a sudden our bodies heal and get better. And so if we can do that, then we can actually start to reevaluate the entire way that we talk about mental illness, which could potentially have a cure.
Wow. Right now, it appears that cost is a barrier, but I assume that, with scale, cost can come down. Do you see a more affordable kind of therapy on the horizon, or is it really going to be mostly cubbyhole for the affluent for now?
I mean, all new treatments go through this path. I think the nice thing is that ketamine therapy is very cheap. Racemic ketamine is actually a really great option because it costs $200 for a month's supply, right? Whereas MDMA therapy with 2 therapists for one treatment course would cost you $14,000 for 3 doses and 42 hours of psychotherapy. Ketamine might cost you, at this point, if you're a single person, $3,500 to $7,000. So it's about half the price. If you think about that cost in terms of the annual cost of paying for an SSRI, or the cost of 2 SSRIs, or 1 hospital admission for somebody who attempts suicide, 1 hospital admission could be $5,000 a day, right? So you avoid 1 hospital admission, you avoid 1 suicide attempt, you avoid 1 of those things in 1 out of every 20 people or something like that, and you have way more than achieved your financial goals for the $7,000 a person per course of medicine. In any preventative care system, it would be a no-brainer, knowing that people with untreated mental illness are the single most expensive patients that we have to care for in the entire health system. The entire health system. These people are just like us, and they not only often can't work and they can't be productive members of society, but they accidentally traumatize other people around them because their trauma is untreated. They self-medicate. They are high utilizers of care. They often wind up in the hospital for different reasons, physical and mental. They are by far, untreated mental illness is by far and well and above the most expensive folks to treat in our entire society. By ignoring those people and not giving them what they need because we perceive it to be too much of an upfront cost, we are hurting all of us. We are literally setting our entire American society back because those numbers of mental health issues are still going up tremendously, and yet there's no treatments being put forward. So I think the answer to all of this for now is group therapy. Group therapy allows us to charge, rather than $7,000 for a course of treatment, you can maybe charge $1,000 for an entire course of treatment. And then you can have 6 to 10 people working with somebody like me, which they normally couldn't access. And then we can all work together. And then everyone in the group reinforces everybody else.
Well, that's the thing. You're fostering community and accountability and promoting shared story and
right.
I mean,
just feeling not alone with your struggle, right? Like if you see that you're in a group of 9 other people and they're having the same problem that you're having in a slightly different way, it makes you feel so much better.
Yeah.
Because you know you're not alone.
Yeah.
You know, it's the whole idea of the show, right? Commune.
Commune. Well, you know, I saw some data, I think out of the Cleveland Clinic, that was treating 2 different cohorts of people with type 2 diabetes, to one group as in community as a group, and one cohort one-on-one, and the fasting glucose levels of the cohort that was being treated as a group were coming down at a rate like a 4x, you know, wow. the people that were being treated individually. So there is something, you know, baked into this notion of community, and I think, you know, this idea of group therapy is absolutely fantastic. Now, I mean, I'm sure that, like with anything, there is the potential for abuse with ketamine. I'm not sure how common that is. I don't know if you have any commentary there in terms.
It's surprisingly common.
It is.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of it is just poor drug education and self-medication.
Right.
Right. So it's people being, if you knew that if you had, number one, if you had tried a whole bunch of other antidepressant medication for your depression, it hadn't worked. And then you were at a party and somebody's like, hey, snort a line of this white powder that makes you feel really nice. And then your depression's gone for 2 weeks after doing that. Yeah. Would you not go back and do that again?
Of course you would.
Would.
Yeah.
Especially if you've had no relief from anything ever, then all of a sudden this does it.
Yeah.
You probably stand a good chance to go back. Right. And similarly, there's no therapeutic frame around that. There's no one telling you and guiding you that says, hey, when you experience what you're going to experience after you ingest this white powder or this medicine, that you're actually going to be experiencing a state of being you can access on your own without the medicine. This is your opportunity to learn what that feels like so you can get there on your own without the medicine, right? If we're doctors and we prescribe ketamine to people in the IV or the IM setting and make them dependent on the medicine by not explaining to them how it works and that they can do it on their own, they just need to learn the techniques, which we're writing a manual now to help explain that to everybody because just not enough of it exists. But if we don't take the responsibility on ourselves to actually explain that properly to people, just like the person at the party, we are misleading our patients to think that the medicine is responsible. Mm-hmm. The medicine is not responsible at all. It's not like an antibiotic. It's more like it's like a tool. It's like a wrench for taking a bolt, loosening a bolt. You know, there's still a lot that has to be done. Most of the work has to be done after you loosen the bolt. Right?
Yeah. Well, Dave, this is really just fascinating and just so exciting to be on the precipice of like something new that can really alleviate a tremendous amount of suffering. I mean, like we said at the beginning, we're talking about 1 in every 8 people globally that are suffering from some form of mental disorder. And like I said, you know, really nobody is unscathed by what's happening right now. So I know I'm not alone in expressing my gratitude for your work and just really just being on the bleeding edge of this work. And it takes a lot of courage and bravery because there's a lot that we just don't know. And so, you know, to be out front is not always the safest place to be. And we know that safety is of utmost importance. So I really applaud your bravery and your thoughtfulness and your rigor around all this. It's just a delight to talk with you. I learned so much when we're together. So thanks so much, man.
Oh, well, likewise. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right. To be continued.
To be continued.
Thanks, Dave.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.